In this video, we are going to analyze a question asked by a student at Oxford University and how Jordan Peterson responded brilliantly. First, let's hear the question.
I just want to pick your thoughts on what you say about freedom of speech and discussions in general, right? Because you basically flagged that, I think, in your answers just then, that freedom of speech has an instrumental purpose. It's there to help us find truth, correct me if I'm wrong, to identify the correctness or the logos against the possible consequence of blood and death. So here's the question, right? If I, as an individual, am affected by discourse in a way that doesn't cause physical violence, so that's not bound by hate speech laws and whatnot, but makes me feel so deeply uncomfortable that I don't belong to society or this community, or when I say something, whenever I try to say something, I'm ridiculed because of my race, the way I talk, or my gender, or the way I behave, then surely that means that my valuable insight to contribute towards logos, towards the pursuit of truth, is shut out by other people's more vociferous speech and more dominant speech. And this is what we see in cases of campuses, whether it be from the right or the left, of people using very violent and loud language to drown out dissent, to drown out those who oppose them on campuses, in society and whatnot. From Donald Trump to people in Swarthmore, we've seen this happen. So wouldn't you say that the attempt to claw back or the right of freedom of speech isn't so far absolute as instrumental? And based on that, therefore, there are some cases where freedom of speech of some individuals can be curtailed if we want to get the better appreciation of the logos and a better inclusion of more voices that are currently being shut out as a result of the extremity and radicalism of those select few. Wouldn't you say that's the case? Thank you.
So with a little bit of analysis, we can see that there is a problem in the question. First of all, this student is willing to regulate another person's free speech to protect his own free speech. This is a very big contradiction. And secondly, if we start regulating free speech, then every speech can be categorized as hate speech. So if you are talking to a big sum of people, you are always going to offend some of those regardless of any preventative measures. Now let's see how Jordan Peterson responds.
Well, there's a very simple answer to that, which is yes. But I'll elaborate. I mean, the first thing is, I'm not an admirer of hate speech laws. But that doesn't mean that I'm naive enough to think that there's no such thing as hate speech. So obviously, if you've ever been involved in an extremely serious argument, you know perfectly well that there's such a thing as hate speech, because you've probably uttered some. So, and there's also no doubt that there are forms of speech that are utterly reprehensible, and some of those are actually already punished by law. You can't incite to violence, you can't libel someone, right? So we have some restrictions already on what's acceptable discourse. Whether it's the case, typically speaking, that some people have more privileged access to free speech than others, well, that's obviously the case. I mean, that's part of power. And power is one of the means by which people climb hierarchies, although the more you can climb a hierarchy by exercising power, the more that's an indication of the fact that that hierarchy has become corrupt. So there's no doubt that these structural impediments to the free exchange of discourse exist. There's also no doubt, as you already laid out, that that's not in everyone's best interest, because what you want, if you have any sense in your society, and this is also why I think that we've put proper emphasis on the sovereignty of the individual, is that you want everyone's logos to have the opportunity to clarify the unknown and reconstitute the world. And if you shut that down, then you risk getting access to the unique insights that that individual might bring. Okay, so I agree with your diagnosis completely. And I think that, even in the West, to ignore the fact that many of our hierarchies tilt towards tyranny and that prejudice still exists in multiple forms is a mistake, although it's only one factor among many and shouldn't be identified as the primary causal determinant of each individual's life. I think that's a dreadful error. The question is, what do you do about it? And the devil's in the details. And as I said already, I'm not an admirer, for example, of hate speech laws, even though there's plenty of hateful speech, because I think the best thing to do is to leave free speech alone as much as you possibly can. Not because that will result in the perfect conditions for free speech, but because anything else that you're likely to do is going to make it worse rather than better. And so that's how it looks to me.
So here Jordan Peterson agreed that there's some problem with free speech. Like there is no doubt that hate speech exists and it would be better if we can avoid it. He also acknowledged that some people have more access to free speech. But he also made it clear that he opposed hate speech laws because it only makes things worse. So the idea here is to let people say what they want so everyone can contribute to society. But we have to take a risk here, that we have to assume that majority of people are wise enough to differentiate between good and bad ideas produced as a result of free speech. The question then becomes, can we trust in the collective wisdom of society to ultimately reject hateful ideas? One argument is that when people are exposed to diverse viewpoints, it encourages them to think critically and thus the society as a whole can avoid hateful idea if majority of people are able to think critically. And even if you do not trust people's ability to think critically, it does not mean that governments should be setting the parameters for free speech. Because throughout history, any attempt to regulate hate speech has resulted in authoritarian governments where people are not even allowed to discuss policy problems or criticize governments. The other problem is that if some powerful people set the parameters for free speech, then marginalized groups and minorities are in trouble. However, it does not mean that free speech should be used to incite violence and harm anyone physically. And there should be laws to prevent such situations. So that's all from this video. If you want to see more of these analyses, please subscribe our channel.